Welcome to the Politics and Media programme. Recent reports apparently suggest that crime among Muslims is on the rise. Yet the Prison Reform Trust has argued that although there has been a big increase in numbers of Muslims in prison, the reasons for this increase are unclear. So is the Muslim community ignoring crime, or is the picture more complex than that? Joining me to discuss the issues are Safiur Rahman, the Director of the Osmani Trust, Asghar Bukhari, founding member of the Muslim Public Affairs Committee UK, and on the phone, Dr Martin Baines, formerly an inspector with the West Yorkshire Police and founding director of the MPACUK Associates. Welcome to the programme, everybody. Asghar, can I come to you first? Do you think that there is an increase, or do you think that this is simply a reflection of the way in which the institutions concerned are working?
Well, I've recently started working in a solicitor's firm, and from anecdotal evidence, from my own experience, there is a huge amount of Muslims going through the criminal justice system, and there's no doubt in my mind that there is some real issues at play and a real problem within the Muslim community. We can't deny that. Whether that reflects other communities that are also being going through the criminal justice system is irrelevant. To me, as a Muslim, the fact that such a large volume of young Muslims are destroying their lives and going, being involved in criminal activity says that something needs to be done, and our social environment is breaking down.
Safiur, what do you think about that?
I think there's definitely an increase in the number of Muslims in prison today. That's without a doubt. The statistics reflect that. Since 2004, I think there's been a 50% increase year on year. It's a percentage or 2%. 2008, it was up to 12% of the prison population were Muslim, and that's compared to 3%
is rising above the level of Muslims in the general population.
Yeah, it is, because Muslims would only account for around 3, if maximum 4% of the population. However, it's a young population in the prison, so therefore what I haven't found is comparative statistics to say what's the Muslim representation in the general youth population. So that would be much higher than 3 or 4%, because the Muslim population in Britain today, 50% are under 25. So you've got a much higher youth population in the Muslim community. So unless we know those figures, we can't really comment whether or not it's over-representation. However, for the Muslim community, any percentage in prison is something that's totally unacceptable if you're claiming to be Muslim and from a faith community.
Let me bring Martin in on this. What do you think is the explanation here? Because the Prison Reform Trust, commenting on these figures, said that that they're unclear about why this is. One of the things that they suggested is that it might be that there are more people in prison who are converting to Islam. What's your take on this?
Well, as I understand it, there is some anecdotal evidence for that, but I think the comment that was just made about the higher youth population is quite significant. I spent all my police career in Bradford, and of course it has the fastest growing population outside London. And that's very much a young population. So I think there are issues there. The difficulty is, of course, that the figures speak for themselves, really. But I think another thing I'd like to say, really, is that in all my experience policing in those communities in Bradford for all those years, and working in Bradford now, is that individuals commit crime, not communities or religions. And therefore, I think what we've got to be careful of with this debate, and it is getting into the public arena, is that communities and religions are not stigmatised. But having said that, I think that there are certainly some issues within communities that people need to be concerned about, and that's around young people. And what I would say, John, on that is that whilst when I was a police officer working in Bradford, one of the things that really concerned me was the lack of good role models for young people. Insufficient role models, and ultimately, in many cases, the role models were the bad guys. It was the drug dealers and the people that were involved in crime, and that was very sad, really. And I think that's why I think the work of the Osmani Trust and other organisations like that throughout the UK, are really important.
We've talked a little bit. I mean, Martin touched on it there. Safiur touched on it about the percentage of youth, and the correlation would not be would be closer if we took the youth. But if we took some other indicators, if we took indicators of poverty, for instance, we would find that there was an element that was perhaps an explanatory element here. If we took the instance of racism or Islamophobia, then these would feed into these statistics, and that doesn't really seem to feature in the debate.
All of these elements that feed into young Muslims turning to crime and having that representation within prison may be some explanation as to why they're turning to it, and why there is these figures. What really is interesting for me is that how is it that a community, a moral community, which is a Muslim community, has abandoned these young people, have given them such a poor lack of guidance, and not only before they went into prison, i.e. moral guidance, but also educational help, or a career and advice, institutional support for these young people. But also, once they're in prison and their lives are destroyed, they come out, they've got a criminal record, they don't know, they're not the most articulate, educated people often within society, and then to abandon them again with the mosques not catering for their educational needs and giving them career advice and getting them back into society, that's the real crime. To me, the fact that these people are in prison, that's one disaster. But the real disaster is we, as a community, allowed that.
Safiur. I have a slightly different take on that, whilst those issues exist within the community. First of all, to say, when we talk about the Muslim community, it's almost as though we're talking about a nation or a kind of national identity, but Muslim simply means one who submits to God, and there's many Muslims who don't submit to God. So it's a bit of a misnomer just to say Muslim community and then look, it's completely the reality on the ground with the young people. It's completely the opposite of what they're supposed to be known for. But I think the big thing that's missing, and what I've seen from the statistics, is the social economic deprivation, which isn't mentioned. If you look at the Muslim community, young people, 30% of British Muslims leave school without any qualifications. That's twice as high as the general population. Pakistanis and Bangladeshis, who make up to about 60% of the British Muslim community, are between 4 and 5 times more likely to be unemployed. The reports on the workforce and labour survey categorically said, regardless of where British Muslims are coming from socially and academically, they're much more likely to face discrimination of all kinds. Housing issues, 35% of Muslims live in social housing. There's another statistic which is alarming. 32% of Muslims live in overcrowded accommodation compared to 6% of the general population. So the Muslim community, if you look at it, for me, is an underclass, is socially deprived, living in inner cities, young population. You've got the last 3 years of austerity and cuts in local services. Osmani Trust, we're struggling to find the finances to carry on our services, So you've got all this financial, social, economic deprivation, and it doesn't matter which religion you're from, which society, which community you're from. If you've got those factors, if you're living in those conditions, I'm not saying let's just blame the social conditions, but you can't ignore them. Mm-hmm. They are a huge factor. And the thing about mosques, I would say, a lot of people like to blame the mosques or imams. They're not doing it. Hold on a minute. These young people, like I said, they identify themselves as Muslims, but they don't necessarily go to the mosques. It's not the imam's duty to, if someone's not in the door of the mosque, the imam's not going to be able to
Unfair.
do anything.
It's not good enough to wipe the...
Most of these young people that I work with, they don't go anywhere near a mosque.
I can't accept that.
They don't go to the mosques.
Okay, well, let's hear
They're
what
on the
Asghar's argument
streets.
is, and then
I
we'll
can't
come
accept
back to it.
that whole argument.
They have a role to play, Mosques have a role.
They have more than a role to play.
But
They
they're
are
not gonna
central. They are central to our decline and our decay, and I'll prove it to you, right?
But these young people don't go to the mosque.
That's the mosque's fault. If you don't play,
it's a young person.
Well, I'll prove it to you. When Sony or any other, look at the difference in the mentality. When any other major institution, let's say Sony PlayStation, anything, when their customers don't buy their product, they say, what's wrong with our product? How do we improve it? The mosques, when no one goes to them, they blame the person for not turning up. It's the mosque's fault people don't turn up because no one understands them. They speak the wrong language. They're living in England and they speak the Pakistani or Gujarati or Arabic. Start speaking the language. Start being connected with those young people, and those young people will come to those mosques. If you can't be bothered to allow those people into the committees to make decisions, to even speak in there without getting kicked out, or speak the wrong language so they don't understand you, and then you blame the young person for not turning up. The cheek of these mosques and the cheek of people defending them. Let me just add some of this. Some of those stats were shocking, weren't they? We are going through a social, economic disaster, a decline that is destroying our young people. And that means, that calls into question, what are we doing about it? You can't say, well, we're just Muslims, you know, we believe in the Prophet and we pray. Is that all we are? Or do we act as a group of people that do some good on this earth, some social good on this earth? And if we actually are a group, a religion that does social good, what social good can we honestly say that we're doing when our community is in prison and without any education and without any jobs?
Let me just bring Martin back in. I mean, Martin, what do you say to the argument that Safiur was making there, that if you started looking at the social and economic indicators, if you looked at overcrowding, if you looked at homelessness, if you looked at poverty, you would find, almost irrespective of religion, the same group of people in prison?
Well, I think first of all, social factors and economic factors do come into it. There's no question of that. You've only to look at the number of young people from Pakistani communities who leave schools without qualifications and can't get jobs, actually, and that's another issue. But I think the most significant and fundamental issue, and it came out in the conversations just now, is who provides support to young people. Because one of the difficulties is that a lot of young people, a lot of young men in particular, are disengaged from the traditional support mechanisms that they might have within families, and that's a real problem. And when young men go into youth offender institutes or prison and they come out again, who's providing that support package and that care that they require in order to play a role in society? I think that's a key issue, really. And I think, you know, something has to be available for these young people, and somebody has to connect with them, because in many cases they've created a subculture of their own.
I mean, you'd have to, I mean, to sustain your case, Asghar, you'd have to say that since this rise has taken place over a relatively recent period of time, that if it were down to the local leadership in the mosque, that would have to have undergone in the same period a kind of degeneration. But that's not strictly credible. I mean, you're much more likely to say,
mosques are a small part of the Muslim community. They're not everything.
They make themselves a small part.
I agree with you. The mosques are not ideal. They're under-resourced.
They make themselves under-resourced.
There's people in the mosque who don't speak English. I agree with you. The imams are imported. But that was a reaction to the situation at that time.
Well, it's not the time now, and they're still imported.
There weren't any British
but they're still imported.
English-speaking imams at that time. Now there are, but can the mosques afford to pay them?
Yes, they can. They pay millions of pounds for extensions. They have millions of pounds on chandeliers and swanky carpets and marble toilets.
Hold on a minute.
You have to let him make his point and then answer it.
Those are the big mosques you're talking about, the one or two here and there. The vast majority of mosques. And I was involved in doing the research on the mosques in the UK back in 2005. And the thousands of mosques in the UK, the vast majority are small, converted houses, relying on voluntary donations. They pay the imams £80 a week. Which British young Muslim with an education and who's gone through training, religious training, would go and work in a mosque for £100 a week. You don't have the financial infrastructure in the mosques to support quality imams. That's the fact. And people.
My mosque has £1 million in its account. £1 million.
If they have, they should.
And what are they going to do with it? Build another extension to make their palace bigger?
They should employ better imams.
But they don't.
I agree with you. But even if the mosques were fantastic, 5-star services, the young people we're talking about, listen, they don't go to the mosques.
Because they're not interested, because the mosques are
they're not interested in a religious life.
No, incorrect.
They're not interested in a religious life.
No. You don't make your religious life interesting to them, and so they're not interested. It's our fault, not their fault.
The trouble is, you want to make this a debate about the weakness of the mosques.
It's an institutional problem.
Don't heckle me because I'm running the programme. But the trouble with your argument is this. If we found, and we would find, that poor Christians and poor Jews and poor atheists all end up in prison because of overcrowding and such things, then your argument's flattened.
No,
because unless you're saying there's insufficiently rigorous religious leadership also among Christians, also among Jews, and whatever that means, among atheists.
Hold on, this is a government problem, this is a local authority problem, this is parental problems. We're not even mentioning the parents. Who gave birth to these young people? Whose responsibility is it to bring up an upright, moral
So why send your children
citizen?
to school?
What do you mean?
Why
for an
don't the
education?
parents educate
No,
them?
I'm talking about.
They gave birth to them.
No, hold on a minute.
It's an institutional problem.
You're going to have to let him make his point. And in a minute, I'm going to come to Martin, because that's the way the programme runs.
What I'm trying to say is there are 10 to 12 different factors to this problem. They all have responsibility. The parents are the primary responsibility. What are 8 and 9-year-old kids doing on a estate at 11 o'clock at night, playing out at night? What are they doing? It's part of the overcrowding, it's part of the parenting, it's part of the whole deprivation. There's no facilities in the area. What about the police? I've worked in the drugs field. Tower Hamlets, East London. You've got estates infested with drug supply. Who's supposed to stop them? Me and you, the mosque, the imam? He's going to come out after prayers and stop a drug dealer?
Well, okay,
That's
let me just bring Martin back in on this. I mean, Martin, all right, the debate here raging is the degree to which the mosque can be isolated as the single causal factor here.
That's a red herring.
Well, let me ask you that question. Do you think that that's a red herring?
Well, the mosque?
Yeah.
No, not necessarily. I think everybody has responsibility with this, and I include the non-Muslim community. You know, it's in everybody's interest really to make sure that the number of young men going into prison from Muslim communities is reduced. But more importantly, that some of the issues that have been discussed, like drug abuse, drug dealing, and crime and criminality, are addressed. Yes, it is a police responsibility to answer the question that was posed. Of course, it's the police responsibility to investigate, detect, and prosecute people who are involved in drug trafficking and crime and criminality. That may be part of the reason why prison populations are going up. At the end of the day, though, one of the key problems, and I mentioned it earlier, is role models. You know, a lot of these young kids on the street, and the gentleman in the debate will know this as well as I do. You know, their role models are the guy who's got money, he's got a flash car. You know, why? Because he or his brother are dealing in drugs. And that disengagement from their own parents, from their own family support mechanisms is a real problem. And that's one of the key things that needs to be addressed.
Do you think that there's? I mean, I know that you have personally done a lot of work in this area. Do you think that one of the problems here is within the police itself, that they are, because of the general political climate, perhaps more sensitive to crime among the Muslim community than they would be in other communities?
I'm not sure that's the case, to be honest. You know, people could say that, but I don't think that's the case. I can tell you now, certainly in West Yorkshire, where I policed all my career, police do not turn a blind eye to criminality and drug dealing. And they want to support communities where these are problems, you know, at the end of the day. But it's like everything else, you know, you only have so many resources to tackle it. But at the end of the day, it's in everybody's interest to deal and prosecute people who deal in drugs. But also, we need to look at the impact that's having upon local communities.
Okay. That's a very good point. I mean, the responsibility, everybody has to take their responsibility. Parents have a responsibility. Mosques do have a responsibility. I totally agree, but not single-handedly. What I'm saying is the police have a huge responsibility, especially in inner cities. If you've got, at the end of the day, a citizen can't go and arrest a drug dealer. Full stop. There's nothing they can do. It's only the police who can deal with that problem, and the police have failed. I can say it categorically, the police have failed. So therefore the question arises, is crime a permanent feature of our society? If it is, then this whole debate might be irrelevant. If crime is a permanent feature of our society, if criminality is becoming a norm in sections of our community, then collectively we failed as a society. You can only minimize something, but drug dealing and drugs in the Muslim community, in the wider community, it accounts for a whole load of crime. It's the lead crime that generates other crime around it. But when you can't get rid of drug dealers, when drugs are pushed into the communities and the police are failing to stop that, failing to stop the import of drugs, you're going to have this. The guy next door is going to see somebody making £500, £1,000 a week, £2,000 a week, because he's not being stopped. Everyone knows he's a dealer, but the police can't arrest him for whatever reason.
That's good. I mean, you've made the point that you believe that the mosque leaderships are at fault here, but you can't believe that they're the only people that are responsible, and that the crime would suddenly decrease if the perfect mosque arrived.
Of course not. But what I want you to understand is just two central parts to the decline, social, economic decline of the Muslims. Why is the mosque such a central element? Because we only have one institution. Everyone's got to play a part, but we're talking about the Muslim community, so Muslims take the central part, right, because of their own community. So just let me finish this point. So if we only have one institution, is it beyond the imagination of the Muslim community to use that facility, to use volunteers that are more than willing to go in and counsel, help, educate, uplift their own community? And when that one institution is denied that role, that central hub, then what have we got left? Then we can only look to the council, to the police, but we can never look within to help ourselves. And that's why I put the case for the mosques. The second thing I argue is Islam itself. When the mosques teach Islam, they teach a Islam of mere rituals. Pray and you're a good Muslim. But they do not say, young man, if you help your brother off the street and educate him, or if you help that prisoner that comes out of the street and educate him, that's when you're a good Muslim. So when Muslims come out of these institutions that do nothing, they themselves do nothing but pray. And so what happens is we have a community that does nothing for ourselves, and that's my complaint.
I think we're trying to expect too much of the mosques. The mosques are run by the first generation of Muslims, generally.
Which is the problem?
First and second. They are a problem, but what do you expect? They've come from villages from the South Asian countries. A lot of them are illiterate. They don't understand the society. Have they got the capability of doing what you're saying?
So
who's
maybe
going to
they
pay
should
for
leave
it?
and get a better leadership?
They should.
You know,
but,
God forbid that.
And that's happening. A lot of mosques, the bigger ones anyway, and that's going to happen through time, through generation, when young people get involved in the masjids. Tower Hamlets, East London has a lot of good mosques there, but what impact has that had on the community? It's had a good impact. However, side by side, the mosque cannot take care of everything. There's young people.
They take care of nothing is my problem.
No, I disagree with you. There's a lot of good projects throughout the country that are dealing with domestic violence, ex-offenders. Mosques have been involved in that, drug programs. So I disagree with you. There are good examples. What I'm saying, these mosques are not resourced to do that kind of work. They're not resourced to do that kind of work. It's purely run on voluntary donations from the community. But, you know, the greater thing in all of this is the social deprivation. It's the economic deprivation, is the housing.
How can we get out of social deprivation? How can we get out of economic deprivation when we ourselves are unwilling to take the bull by the horns and say, let's do something about it?
I'm going to have to stop you there because that's about all that we've got time for on this subject. I'm sure we'll return to it again in future episodes, but do join us for the second part of the Media and Politics programme very, very shortly.